The hard truth is this. Every time you refuse to look at yourself, you do not stay the same. You become harder to live with. Avoidance feels like relief, but it is a kind of slow self-abandonment, and it collects interest. If you stay with me, you will not get a set of slogans. You will get something rarer, a clearer relationship with your own mind. You will see what avoidance actually costs: your freedom, your peace, your ability to love and to choose. And you will learn a sober, practical way to face yourself without collapsing into shame or drifting into self-obsession. Most people think not looking is neutral. They think if they ignore a fear, it will quiet down. If they avoid a memory, it will fade. If they keep busy, they will outrun whatever follows them. But the mind is not a room you can leave dark and expect to stay clean. What you refuse to face does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes mood, posture, reflex. It becomes the tone in your voice when someone asks an honest question. It becomes the impatience you call standards, the distance you call privacy, the constant low-grade tension you call normal life. Here is the first reversal. Avoiding yourself is not an absence of work. It is work, constant, exhausting work. It takes effort to keep your attention pointed away from the places that hurt. It takes effort to maintain a story that protects you from what you suspect might be true. And because that effort is rarely conscious, you misread your own fatigue. You think life is heavy. Sometimes it is. But sometimes what is heavy is the labor of not knowing yourself. The Stoics, when they spoke about freedom, did not mean the freedom to do whatever you want. They meant the freedom of a person who is not being dragged around by unseen forces inside them. Epictetus spoke as if the mind were a city. Either you govern it, or you are governed by it. That does not sound poetic until you notice how many of your days are ruled by impulses you did not choose. Checking your phone not because you decided to, but because silence feels too intimate. Agreeing too quickly because conflict would expose how afraid you are of being disliked. Staying productive because stillness might invite a thought you have been postponing for years. Consider a modern example that looks harmless. You finish a long day and you reach for entertainment with the speed of habit. The show begins, the scrolling begins, the noise begins. You tell yourself you're relaxing. But watch closely. What you are avoiding is not effort. It is contact. Contact with your own interior. In the quiet before the screen lights up, something is waiting. An unanswered question, a grief you have edited out, a dissatisfaction you keep calling restlessness. Avoidance, in this form, becomes a lifestyle. Not a dramatic escape, but a steady refusal to be alone with your own mind. Here is another reversal. When you avoid looking at yourself, you do not eliminate pain. You concentrate it. Unexamined pain does not sit politely in a corner. It spills into the closest available spaces. It becomes irritation at small inconveniences. It becomes cynicism disguised as intelligence. It becomes the sudden coldness in a relationship when a partner asks for honesty and you can only offer performance. The Stoics did not fear emotion. They feared confusion, feelings without understanding, reactions without ownership. A hard truth follows. If you will not face yourself, you will ask the world to carry what belongs to you. You will want other people to regulate your nervous system, to confirm your worth, to justify your choices, to absorb your anger. You will call it love or fairness or loyalty. But underneath, it is often a quiet transaction. Please do not make me feel what I refuse to look at. And the world cannot keep that bargain. People have limits. Circumstances shift. So your peace becomes dependent, and dependence is not peace. It is a hostage situation with a polite face. Reflect on what it means to live without inner inspection. You begin to identify with the outer surface of your life. Achievements, roles, opinions, a curated personality. The self becomes a resume with feelings attached. And because that outer self is always exposed to change, someone younger arrives, a job is lost, a relationship ends, a body ages. You become anxious not because you are weak, but because your foundation is not a foundation. It is weather. A practical example. Think of how quickly we learn to talk about ourselves as brands. We manage perception. We avoid contradictions. We keep the story consistent. But a human being is not consistent. A human being is honest, and honesty includes tension. When you cannot admit, even to yourself, I am envious, I am afraid, I am lonely, you do not become pure. You become split, and a split self is always performing. Even rest becomes a performance, because you're not resting as you are resting as who you think you should be. Here is the reversal that stings. Avoiding yourself often looks like humility. You say, I don't want to dwell on myself. You keep moving. You stay useful. You become the person who takes care of others, who solves problems, who stays composed. But sometimes that composure is not strength. It is fear of being seen. It is fear that if you look inward, you will find something unacceptable. The Stoics would call that fear a kind of slavery, not to a tyrant outside you, but to a verdict you have not even examined. The Stoic tool here is simple, but not easy: the discipline of attention. Not dramatic introspection, not endless analysis, but the quiet habit of noticing what is driving you. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections not to impress anyone, but to stop lying to himself in subtle ways. He treated his own mind as something he was responsible for. That is a different posture from modern self-hate and a different posture from modern self-indulgence. It is dignity. Now, a hard truth about control. When you refuse to look at yourself, you start reaching for control everywhere else. You try to control outcomes, people's impressions, timing, certainty. But control is not the cure for inner avoidance. It is the symptom. A person at peace can tolerate uncertainty. A person who is running from themselves cannot, because uncertainty creates space, and space invites the self to appear. You can see this in the smallest moments. You send a message and then refresh for a reply. You check metrics, likes, updates. You plan conversations in your head to avoid being surprised. Not because the world is truly dangerous, but because you have not learned to sit with your own inner reactions. The Stoics offered a harsh comfort. You cannot guarantee outcomes, but you can train your response. That training begins the moment you stop running. Before we cross into the next half, there is a brief invitation. If this kind of reflection is useful to you, subscribe to the channel and leave a thoughtful comment about one place in your life where you notice avoidance, quietly, honestly, without judging yourself. Reading how others name their inner life changes the conversation for all of us. Avoiding yourself has a final cost that people often do not anticipate. It steals meaning. Meaning is not something you find by decorating your life with distractions. Meaning is what grows when your actions align with what you truly value. And you cannot know what you value if you will not look. The Stoics spoke often about virtue, not as moral perfection, but as integrity, the inner coherence of a person who is not divided against themselves. Integrity is not loud. It is stable. It is the calm strength of someone who can say, "This is what I am afraid of," and still choose what is right. And here is the last reversal of this first half. The thing you are avoiding is not your enemy. It is your messenger. Fear is not only a threat, it is information. Shame is not only poison. It is a signal about where you have handed your worth to an external judge. Anxiety is not only suffering. It is often the body's testimony that the mind is trying to live a life it cannot honestly support. If you keep refusing the messenger will not stop. It will simply raise its voice. So the question becomes quieter and more serious. What happens when you do look? In the second half of this journey, we do not romanticize self-confrontation. We make it human. Looking at yourself is not standing in a mirror and searching for flaws. It is sitting down interiorly and telling the truth without cruelty. It is the beginning of freedom because it ends the need to pretend. The hard truth is that looking at yourself will hurt at first, not because self-knowledge is inherently painful, but because you have been carrying unopened rooms. When you open them, air moves, dust rises. But pain here is not punishment, it is contact. And contact is the first step toward choice. The Stoic approach is not to chase feelings, but to clarify judgments. A feeling often arrives with a hidden sentence attached. Anger says, I am being disrespected and that must not happen. Envy says, their success means my failure. Anxiety says, if I cannot predict it, I cannot survive it. To look at yourself is to find these sentences, examine them, and decide whether they deserve authority. This is not self-help optimism. It is intellectual honesty applied to the inner life. A practical example. You receive criticism at work. Immediately your body tightens, your mind rushes, and you start preparing a defense. If you avoid looking at yourself, you call the critic unfair, you rehearse your resentment, and you carry it home. If you do look, you pause long enough to ask, what exactly am I protecting? Often it is not your work. It is your image, not your competence, your identity as someone who must not be questioned. In that moment, the critic becomes less important than your reaction, because your reaction is where your freedom is either lost or regained. Here is the reversal. Self-examination is not self-accusation. Many people avoid looking because they assume it will turn into shame. But shame is only one possible outcome, and it is usually the outcome of looking without wisdom. The Stoics offer another possibility, to see your flaws as material, not as verdicts. A flaw is something to train, not a sentence to serve. If you are impatient, you practice patience. If you're defensive, you practice receiving reality. If you're addicted to approval, you practice doing the right thing unseen. The point is not to become flawless. The point is to become governed. Another hard truth. When you finally look at yourself, you may realize you have been living by borrowed values. You have been pursuing goals that sounded respectable, not goals that felt true. You have been chasing security, but calling it ambition. You have been craving praise, but calling it excellence. That realization can feel like losing a map, but it is actually the first time you are holding one that is yours. A deep reflection. The self you avoid is not only your pain, it is also your conscience. It is the part of you that knows when you are making compromises that will cost you later. The Stoics treated conscience not as a moral scold, but as an inner companion. When you betray it repeatedly, you do not become freer, you become numb. Numbness is not peace. It is anesthesia, and life, under anesthesia, can look functional while feeling strangely unreal. A modern example. You stay in a relationship where you are subtly diminished. Nothing dramatic happens. There are no bruises, no public betrayals, just a steady erosion. Your needs become inconvenient, your boundaries become negotiable, your personality becomes something you edit to keep the peace. If you avoid looking at yourself, you call it maturity. If you look, you notice the truth. You are trading your inner dignity for outer stability. The Stoics would not tell you to explode. They would tell you to reclaim what is yours. The ability to say no, the ability to choose discomfort over self-erasure, the ability to respect yourself enough to be honest. Here is the reversal that restores strength. Looking at yourself does not make you self-centered. It makes you less dependent on being centered by others. When you know your motives, your fears, your patterns, you stop demanding that the world constantly reassure you. You become steadier in conflict because you are not fighting for your identity. You become calmer in uncertainty because you are not confusing uncertainty with danger. You become kinder, not as a performance, but as a byproduct of not needing to win every emotional moment. The Stoic concept of control becomes practical here. You cannot control how people interpret you. You cannot control whether a plan succeeds. You cannot control whether life changes suddenly. But you can control your judgments, your choices, your character. And the astonishing thing is this. The more you accept what you cannot control, the more power you recover over what you can. Avoidance lies to you by saying, if I don't look, I'll stay safe. Reality answers, if you don't look, you will be controlled by what you refuse to name. A practical method, simple enough to begin tonight, is the brief internal audit. Not a diary of drama. Just 3 questions held quietly. What did I feel strongly today? What story did I attach to it? What did I choose because of that story? This is Stoicism as lived experience. Over time, you see patterns. You see that your anger rises when you feel powerless. You see that your anxiety rises when you treat other people's opinions as verdicts. You see that your sadness rises when you abandon your own needs. And once you see, you are no longer purely reacting. You are learning. Another hard truth. You may discover that some of your suffering is self-made. Not because you are at fault for being human, but because your mind has been trained poorly. Many people speak to themselves in a voice they would never use on a friend. They confuse harshness with discipline. The Stoics were disciplined, but not contemptuous. They corrected themselves as a teacher corrects a student, firmly, but with an aim toward improvement, not humiliation. If you look at yourself and only find insults, you are not looking clearly. You are repeating an old punishment. A deep reflection on fear. Fear is often the guardian of what matters. If you are afraid to be alone, it may be because you have avoided meeting yourself. If you are afraid to fail, it may be because you have tied your worth to outcomes. If you are afraid of being seen, it may be because you believe your true self is unacceptable. Looking at yourself does not eliminate fear. It separates fear from authority. You learn to say, I feel fear, without adding, therefore I must obey it. A modern example. You want to change your life, health, work, creativity, relationships, but you keep waiting for confidence. You wait until you feel ready, until the fear is gone, until the conditions are perfect. If you avoid looking at yourself, you call it preparation. If you look, you see the truth, you are bargaining with discomfort. Stoic courage is not dramatic heroism. It is the quiet decision to act according to your values while fear is still present, like walking with a trembling hand that still opens the door. Here is the reversal that brings peace. Inner peace is not a mood. It is a practice of alignment. It is what happens when your outer life stops contradicting your inner knowledge. When you do what you say matters. When you stop asking the world to make you feel safe, and you begin making yourself trustworthy to yourself. This is why the Stoics could face loss, illness, exile, criticism, not because they were numb, because they had an inner home that did not depend entirely on external weather. If you avoid looking at yourself, you live in exile from that home. You become a stranger to your own motives. You drift toward distraction because the self feels like a problem to manage rather than a life to inhabit. But when you do look steadily, honestly, without theatrics, you begin to gather yourself. The mind becomes less noisy not because life becomes easy, but because you stop running two lives, the one you live and the one you pretend is happening. So let this be the closing thought, not as a summary, but as a direction for the next quiet moment you have. The life you want is not waiting on the other side of perfect circumstances. It is waiting on the other side of a truthful gaze. What you refuse to face will rule you in silence, and what you are willing to face will set you free.